Well, thank you, Martha, for that story. It made me think this is the story I wanted to tell tonight. When I was in 6th grade, my teacher, Mrs. Burt, sent home a note with every kid in our class. This note was an invitation. She said that a week from Friday, we were going to have something called Dad's Day. And all of our daddies who could were invited to come to our 6th grade classroom that Friday and talk about their professions. I said, my daddy doesn't have a profession. My daddy has a job. Miss Burt said, that'd be just fine. He could come and talk about his job. Now, I was pretty sure that Betty Gale McCall's daddy was going to come. He was a professor of law at the Baylor University Law School. And Mary Dunwoody's daddy, we hoped would come because he was a sales representative for the Mars Candy Company. We wanted him to come and bring some samples. Linda Ledbetter's daddy was a preacher. We didn't care much if he came or not. Bubba Bodenhammer's daddy was the assistant manager at the skating rink. And Calvin Conley's daddy was an undertaker. Woo! It didn't get much better than that, except for Carlene Prevet's dad, who was a tattoo artist. Now, this was going to be an occasion of pride for a lot of the kids in my 6th grade class. For me, not so much. My daddy was a janitor at the Baylor University School of Law, where Betty Gale McCall's daddy was a professor. I was pretty sure there wasn't a 6th grade kid on the face of the earth who wanted to hear my daddy talk about floor waxing and trash removal. Now, back when I was younger, when I was 6 going on 7 instead of 12 going on 20, I was proud of my daddy. I was proud of him and his uniform and the job that he did. He was my hero. I thought he was so handsome in that bright green Baylor University uniform with his name spelled out in gold embroidery. A great big Baylor bear's head right there on his shoulder. Sometimes on school holidays or on Saturdays when Daddy had to work, he would take me to work with him. I loved being there with my dad because he taught me how to do things. He showed me how to change all the toilet paper rolls in the bathrooms at the law school and how to change all the paper towels. He even gave me my own key to the paper goods closet. One day, Daddy got one of those big industrial size cores of a toilet paper roll, and he cut it down and made it so that it looked like a crown. He put it on my head, and he proclaimed me the toilet paper princess. Whenever it came time to gather up the trash all over the building, Daddy and I did it together. We would go down to his closet and we would get out 2 rolling trash carts. That was when we played Lone Ranger and Tonto. I always wanted to be Tonto, so Daddy had to be the Lone Ranger. We would use those trash carts as our horses, Silver and Scout. We'd jump up on those trash carts and we'd start running them down the hall, and Daddy would look into a classroom as we went by and he'd say, there you go, there's a bad guy in there. And of course it was a trash can, but Daddy would say, go get him, Tonto. I'd run in there and I'd get that trash can, I'd bring it out and I'd hand it up to my daddy, and Daddy'd take that bad guy and he'd turn him upside down over his saddlebags on his horse, Silver, and he'd whoop the rear end of that bad guy and all his guts would fall out into my daddy's plastic saddlebags. Well, after we'd managed to pick up all the bad guys in the law building that night and got that place cleaned up, Daddy would say, all right, Tonto, where are we going now? And together we would sing as we went out the back door of the law school, to the dump, to the dump, to the dump, 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 to the dump, to the dump, to the dump, dump, dump. we'd empty those saddlebags into those big disposals out in the back of the law school. And, well, going to the law school to work with my daddy was more fun than going to the Melrose movie theater on a Saturday afternoon. But by the time I got to 6th grade, I had learned to be embarrassed about my daddy's job. I did not want him to show up in my 6th grade classroom. He didn't look like a hero to me anymore. He looked like the Jolly Green Giant. Well, I took that note that Ms. Burt had given each of us to take home, and it was sort of hanging out of my notebook that day as I walked home. I just kind of let it flop in the breeze. I really was hoping it would just fly right out of that notebook and get lost in the gutters somewhere on the way home. But it didn't, of course. It made it home with me. I didn't take it out of the notebook and give it to my dad. I just let it lie around in my room for a day or two, hoping it would just slip underneath the bed and get lost. But that didn't happen either. My mama, who never could mind her own business when I was 12 years old, found that note in my room. And she came walking out of there with it. She held it up and she said, "Baby, don't you think you ought to give this to your daddy? It is addressed to him." And I said, "No, I don't want my daddy to come to school and talk about his job. My daddy does not have anything educational to say. He is not interesting." And my mom said, "Baby, I have been trying not to listen to your daddy for the last 25 years, but I can't help myself. He is good at talking. If there's one thing your daddy is for sure, it's interesting. I think you ought to give him this note." So I did. I walked in, handed my dad the note. He read it, and then he looked up at me. He saw the look on my face, and he said, "You don't want me to come to your classroom, do you?" He reached out and he put his hands on my shoulders. He said, "You're afraid I'll embarrass you." He said, "You know, baby, one time Abraham Lincoln said, 'Whatever you are, be a good one.' And I am a dadgum good janitor. But if you don't want me to come to your classroom and embarrass you talking about my job, then all right, I won't. Oh, I'm coming to your classroom, all right. But I won't talk about being a janitor. I'll talk about my secret profession. Don't worry about a thing, Kemosabe. It's all going to be all right." Well, all I could do was wait in dread for Dad's day the following Friday. Now, meanwhile, my daddy, he made some arrangements. He called up Miss Burt, and he set it up so that he would be the last dad on the program that day. He told her he'd be there between 10:30 and 10:45, not to worry, he'd get there. And then he went and talked to his boss at Baylor, and he asked if he could take his lunch early that Friday so that he could leave Baylor and get up to the 6th grade classroom on time. Well, sure enough, that Friday came. It had been a good morning. We had listened to Dr. McCall talk about criminals and executions, all of which are very popular topics in the state of Texas. And we'd gotten samples from Mr. Dunwoody. We were sitting there eating Snickers and Milky Ways and Three Musketeers. And then I heard a sound out in the hall. I looked at my watch, and it was 10:35. And then I heard my daddy's baritone voice out there. "Come with me now, boys and girls, to the thrilling days of yesteryear.
A fiery horse with the speed of light, a cloud of dust, and a hearty, "Hi-yo, Silver!" And my dad walked into my 6th grade classroom. He was still wearing his Jolly Green Giant pants, but on top was a white shirt, double-breasted, black buttons. He had a red bandana around his neck, a big white Stetson on his head, boots on his feet, and a black mask around his eyes. I just dropped my face to my desk. Bubba Bodenhammer, who sat across the aisle from me, reached over and he punched me on the shoulder. He said, "Babs McBride, I didn't know your daddy was a Lone Ranger." I rolled my face over toward him. I said, "You think you're surprised?" Daddy got on into the classroom, and Miss Bird at the back of the room stood up and started to applaud. Dr. McCall stood up and started to clap. All the dads back there were clapping, and as my dad came into the room, I heard the kids around us saying, "You think he's really Clayton Moore? You know, he used to be a Texas Ranger before he became the Lone Ranger. No, I think he's the one on the radio." Well, my daddy got up to the front of the room and he held up his hands to quieten all the kids down. And he looked at them and he said, "No, boys and girls, I am not Clayton Moore. He's just a TV actor. And I'm not Brace Beamer. He's just a radio actor. I am the true masked man whose identity will never be revealed." Little Lupe Gonzalez, who sat up on the front row, reached out and patted my daddy's hand, and she said, "Don't worry, Mr. McBride, we won't tell nobody." Well, about that time, Calvin Conley, the undertaker's kid, raised his hand and he said, hey, Mr. Ranger, how many bad guys have you killed?" And my dad said, "Son, I like to think of myself as the champion of truth and justice. I never shoot to kill. My silver bullets are precious, just like life, and I don't want to waste either one of them. Speaking of silver bullets, how would you boys and girls like to have a silver bullet of your own?" Oh, everybody's mouth flew up. Daddy reached down into his green pockets and he pulled out 2 hands full of silver bullets. Well, everybody forgot about their Snickers and their Milky Ways and Three Musketeers because they wanted a silver bullet. We started passing them around the classroom, and when I got mine, I lifted my head up off my desk and I rolled it around my hand and looked at it, and I knew where it had come from. My daddy's real secret profession was that he was a junk collector, and he was also a craftsman, pretty good one. He'd managed to take some scrap metal that was piled up behind our garage and shaped it into silver bullets. Well, after we all had our bullets, my daddy spent about a half an hour talking about truth and justice in ways that 6th graders could understand. My daddy did not sound like a man who had only a 6th grade education himself. He sounded like a man who could have been in charge at the Baylor University School of Law. After he made that little talk to us, then he said he wanted to tell us about some of his adventures with Tonto out on the range. He said, you know, they had a hard job out there cleaning up the range from all the bad guys. He said, you know, sometimes people talk about me and Tonto and our adventures and they tell jokes about us. Would y'all like to hear a Lone Ranger and Tonto joke? Well, of course, what 6th grader doesn't want to hear a joke? Daddy said, all right, then I'll tell you one of my favorites. Kids started to clap. Well, I knew that my daddy had about 1,000 Lone Ranger and Tonto jokes in his head. Once he got started, there's no telling when he was going to stop. Probably wouldn't stop till we went home that afternoon. But he launched into his favorite joke. He said, you know, one time, me and Tonto, we was out on the range and we got out into the desert just about sundown. And it started getting dark, so we set up our tent, decided we'd just sleep out there in the desert that night. Well, we crawled into our tent, we were so tired we just fell asleep. Well, sometime in the wee hours of the morning, Tonto, he punches me and he says, "Kimosabe, look up, what do you see?" And I looked up and I saw stars. I said, "Tonto, I see millions of stars up there, millions of them." And Tonto says, "What's that tell you?" "Well, Tonto, astronomically, it tells me there might be millions of planets and millions of galaxies. Astrologically, it tells me that Leo is in Saturn. Theologically, it tells me that there is a creator greater than all of us. Time-wise, it tells me it's about 3 o'clock in the morning. And weather-wise, it tells me we're going to have a mighty fine day. So, Tonto, what does it tell you?" Tonto rolled over and he said, "Tells me somebody stole our tent, paleface." The kid in my 6th grade classroom who laughed the loudest was Elijah Big Pond. Elijah was half Indian, half Comanche and half Apache. He stood up. He said, "Mr. Lone Ranger, my dad couldn't come today. He's a cop and he couldn't get off work. Could I tell my dad's favorite joke since he couldn't be here?" My dad looked back at Ms. Burt and she nodded approval, and so my daddy said, "Sure, son, come on up." So Elijah came up and my dad put his arm around his shoulder and Elijah told us his dad's favorite joke. Then Mario Lopez raised his hand. He said, "My daddy couldn't be here either. Can I come up and tell you something about my dad?" "Sure, come on up, son." Mario told us about his daddy. Pretty soon, every kid in the class whose daddy hadn't been able to come to school that day for Dad's Day got a chance to tell us something about their dad. And those who didn't have daddies at home told us about their grandpas. Even little Lupe Gonzalez up on the front row, she told about how excited she was that finally maybe her daddy would have enough money to leave Mexico and come and be with the rest of the family in Waco, Texas at Christmas time. Well, it was getting up close to noontime by then, and Miss Burt said that we were going to have to go to lunch, so we'd have to say goodbye to the Lone Ranger. All the kids started saying, "No, Miss Burt, can't the Lone Ranger stay for lunch?" My daddy said, "No, boys and girls, I got to get out there in the Badlands. There's things that need to be cleaned up out there." So everybody wanted to walk Daddy out, but he said, "No, I'll just say goodbye here at the door, but you can wave to me from the window if you want to." Daddy walked toward the door of the classroom, but he stopped at my desk. He got down on one knee. He took off his white Stetson and he put it on my head. He said, "Little lady, I want to thank you for inviting me here today. It's been a pleasure." And then the Lone Ranger, bald and proud, walked toward the door of my classroom, and I could hear him under his breath singing, "To the dump, to the dump, to the dump, dump, dump." All the kids in my class jumped up and they ran to the windows of our second floor classroom, and they looked out as my dad got in his old gray pickup truck out in the parking lot and drove off in a cloud of dust. And the kids were all yelling, "Hi-yo, Silver, away!" We got lined up, we started down for the lunchroom, and as we were walking in that line down the hall, Betty Gail McCall caught up to me. She said, "Babs McBride, your daddy, oh, he is the most interesting daddy of any kid in our class." I said, I know. And I did. And I never forgot it again. My dad, he was a dadgum good dad. And he was a dadgum good janitor too. He waxed floors, he removed trash, and he was proud of the work he did. And in the thrilling days of yesteryear, my daddy taught me to never judge a man by the clothes that he wears. Rest in peace, Kimosabe.